The smallest act of kindness can change a life, but sometimes it changes your own first. Sarah Bennett whispered those words to herself as she stood outside a small grocery store on a cold autumn evening. The sky above the town was turning gray, and a light drizzle had begun to fall. In her coat pocket, she carried exactly $12.37. It was all the money she had until her next paycheck arrived 3 days later. Sarah pulled her coat tighter and glanced at the list she had written on a folded receipt. Milk for Emma, bread, peanut butter. She mentally calculated every dollar. Being a single mother meant every decision mattered. Every purchase had consequences. At 35 years old, Sarah had become an expert at stretching a budget further than she ever imagined possible. Earlier that morning, she had worked a 6-hour shift at Cooper's Bakery, the small family-owned shop where she had been employed for nearly 4 years. Business had been slower than usual, and Linda Cooper, the owner, had apologized for reducing everyone's hours. Sarah understood. Linda was struggling too. These days it seemed everyone was trying to hold on. After buying the groceries she needed most, Sarah checked the remaining cash in her wallet. Just enough for a small container of soup and a bread roll from the cafe next door. She had skipped lunch and breakfast had been little more than coffee. The warm meal felt like a rare luxury. Inside the cafe, only a few customers remained. Sarah ordered the soup and bread and found a quiet table near the window. The scent alone made her stomach ache with hunger. She wrapped her hands around the bowl and prepared to take her first bite when she noticed someone sitting alone near the entrance. The man appeared to be in his early 40s. His dark coat was damp from the rain. He looked exhausted. Not physically exhausted, but emotionally tired in a way Sarah recognized immediately. There was something lonely about him. The cafe owner approached the man and quietly explained that the kitchen was closing. The stranger nodded politely, thanked him, and prepared to leave. As he stood, Sarah noticed him glance briefly toward the menu board before turning away. She could not explain why, but something about the moment stayed with her. Perhaps it was because she knew exactly what it felt like to want a meal and worry about whether you could afford one. Before she had time to overthink it, Sarah stood and walked toward him. "Excuse me," she said. The man turned. "Yes." Sarah lifted the bread roll and soup container. "I know this might sound strange, but would you like to share this with me?" The stranger looked genuinely surprised. "I could not take your dinner." Sarah smiled softly. "Then do not take it. Share it." For a moment, he simply stared at her. Then he nodded. They returned to the table together. The soup was divided into 2 smaller bowls. The bread was split evenly. It was not much food, but somehow it felt enough. As they ate, conversation came naturally. The man introduced himself only as Ethan. Sarah shared her first name, but little else. They talked about ordinary things. The weather, the town, life. Yet beneath the simple conversation, Sarah sensed a kindness and thoughtfulness she rarely encountered. For nearly 40 minutes, they talked while rain tapped softly against the windows. Eventually, the cafe prepared to close. Ethan stood and thanked her. "Most people would have walked past me tonight," he said. Sarah shrugged. "Most people have their own problems." Ethan smiled. "And you still stopped." Sarah gathered her things. "Sometimes that is exactly why people should stop." Ethan seemed to consider her words carefully. Then he asked one final question. "Sarah Bennett, right?" Sarah nodded, surprised he remembered. Ethan smiled warmly. "I do not think I will forget that name." As he stepped into the rain and disappeared into the evening, Sarah assumed she would never see him again. She had no way of knowing that the stranger she shared her last meal with was about to change the course of her entire future. She had no way of knowing that the stranger she shared her last meal with was about to change the course of her entire future. The next morning, Sarah Bennett woke before sunrise as she always did. The small apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of traffic outside. She moved carefully through the kitchen, preparing breakfast before waking her 9-year-old daughter. There was something comforting about routines. Even when life felt uncertain, routines created the illusion of stability. Soon Emma appeared wearing oversized pajamas and rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Good morning, Mom," she said. Sarah smiled and placed a plate in front of her. "Good morning, sweetheart." They ate together while discussing school projects, upcoming assignments, and weekend plans that would probably never happen because money remained tight. Still, Sarah did her best to keep disappointment from entering their conversations. Emma deserved optimism. After dropping her daughter at school, Sarah headed to Cooper's bakery. The familiar smell of fresh bread greeted her as she entered. Linda Cooper was already arranging pastries inside the display case. "Morning, Sarah," she called. "Morning." Linda studied her for a moment. "You look tired." Sarah laughed softly. "That is becoming my permanent look." The morning passed quickly. Customers came and went. Coffee was poured. Orders were packaged. The work itself was not difficult, but the long hours and financial pressure never seemed to disappear. During her lunch break, Sarah found herself thinking about the stranger from the previous evening. Ethan. She could still remember the thoughtful way he listened. Most conversations in her life felt rushed. People waited for their turn to speak. Ethan had actually listened. The memory surprised her more than she wanted to admit. Across town, the same man sat inside a temporary office overlooking Main Street. Several reports covered the conference table in front of him. Financial forecasts, development proposals, property evaluations. Ethan Walker studied each document carefully. For nearly 3 months, he had been quietly visiting small communities across the state. His company planned to launch a major investment initiative focused on economic growth in struggling towns. The project would create jobs, support local businesses, and fund community programs. Before making any decisions, Ethan preferred seeing places for himself. Numbers told part of the story. People told the rest. The previous evening had affected him more than expected. Throughout his career, Ethan had met influential leaders, politicians, investors, and executives. Yet the person he found himself thinking about was a single mother who had shared her last meal without expecting anything in return. That kind of generosity was rare. Later that afternoon, Sarah finished her shift and walked to Emma's school. The two stopped at a nearby park before heading home. Emma climbed onto a swing while Sarah watched from a nearby bench. "Can I ask you something?" Emma said. "Of course. Do you ever get lonely?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She considered her answer carefully. "Sometimes." Emma slowed her swing slightly. "Me too." Sarah felt her heart tighten. She moved closer and wrapped an arm around her daughter. "You are not alone, sweetheart." Emma smiled. "I know. Because I have you." The simple words stayed with Sarah all evening. After Emma went to bed, Sarah sat beside the window with a cup of tea. Rain had returned. She watched droplets slide down the glass and found herself wondering where Ethan was tonight. The thought felt strange. She barely knew him, yet something about their conversation lingered. Several miles away, Ethan sat alone in a hotel room, reviewing notes from his community visits. Among pages filled with business observations, one sentence stood out. He had written it immediately after leaving the cafe. Sometimes that is exactly why people should stop. Ethan read the line again and smiled. Then he opened a new page and wrote a name at the top. Sarah Bennett. He did not know it yet, but before long, their paths were destined to cross again in a way neither of them could possibly expect. He did not know it yet, but before long, their paths were destined to cross again in a way neither of them could possibly expect. The following weeks passed much like the ones before them. Sarah Bennett continued balancing work, motherhood, and the constant challenge of making every dollar stretch as far as possible. Some mornings began before 6 o'clock. Some evenings ended long after. Emma had fallen asleep. Life moved forward one day at a time. At Cooper's bakery, business remained unpredictable. Certain days brought a steady stream of customers. Others were painfully slow. Linda Cooper did everything she could to keep the small business running, but everyone could feel the pressure. One afternoon, after reviewing monthly numbers, Linda gathered her employees together. Sarah immediately sensed concern in her expression. "I want to be honest with everyone," Linda said. "Sales are down again this month." The room grew quiet. "I am not closing," Linda quickly added, "but I may need to reduce hours temporarily." Sarah felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. Reduced hours meant reduced income. Reduced income meant difficult decisions at home. After the meeting ended, she returned to work without complaint. Worry would not solve anything. Still, the news followed her throughout the day. That evening, Sarah sat at the kitchen table reviewing bills while Emma worked on a science project nearby. The numbers never seemed to cooperate. Rent, utilities, school expenses, groceries. She carefully adjusted her budget again, searching for solutions that did not exist. Finally, Emma looked up. "Everything okay?" Sarah smiled despite her concerns. "Everything will be okay." Emma studied her for a moment. "That is your answer every time." Sarah laughed softly. Because it is the answer I choose. Emma smiled and returned to her project. Across town, Ethan Walker attended a private meeting inside a conference room occupied by consultants, advisors, and project managers. Maps covered the walls. Economic reports filled binders across the table. The Community Investment Initiative had reached a critical stage. Several towns were competing for funding. Millions of dollars were involved. Most participants focused on statistics and financial projections. Ethan listened carefully before asking a different question. Which communities demonstrate the strongest local character? Several people exchanged confused glances. One advisor finally answered. We have data on employment rates, business growth, and infrastructure needs. Ethan nodded. I have seen the data. He paused. I am asking about people. The room fell silent. Ethan had built his success on a simple belief. Healthy communities were created by good people. Numbers mattered, but character mattered too. During the discussion, one town continued standing out. The same town where Sarah lived. The same town where he had shared a simple meal with a stranger who expected nothing in return. Days later, Ethan returned quietly to the area. He spent time visiting local businesses and speaking with residents. Most people never recognized him. He preferred it that way. One afternoon, while walking along Main Street, he noticed a familiar bakery. Through the front window, he saw Sarah helping customers while balancing multiple responsibilities at once. She moved quickly, greeted everyone warmly, and somehow found time to encourage a nervous teenage employee struggling with a complicated order. Ethan remained outside for several minutes watching the scene unfold. Not because of personal feelings. At least that was what he told himself. What truly caught his attention was the way Sarah treated people. She carried herself with kindness even while facing challenges most customers would never notice. Later that evening, Ethan reviewed notes from his visit. Once again, Sarah's name appeared among them. Meanwhile, Sarah had no idea she was being observed. She simply continued doing what she always did. Showing up, working hard, taking care of Emma, hoping tomorrow would be a little easier than today. Yet change was already moving quietly toward her life. Because early the next morning, several black vehicles would arrive in town, and their destination would be a small bakery on Main Street. Sarah Bennett arrived at Cooper's Bakery shortly before 7 o'clock the next morning. The sun had barely risen, and the town still carried the quiet calm that existed before the workday began. She unlocked the front door, switched on the lights, and began preparing display cases for customers. For the first hour, everything felt normal. Then shortly after 9 o'clock, an unusual sight appeared outside the bakery window. Several black vehicles pulled up along the curb. Their arrival immediately attracted attention from pedestrians and nearby business owners. Sarah glanced outside briefly before returning to her work. She assumed some local officials were visiting the area. A few moments later, the bakery door opened. Several professionally dressed men and women entered, followed by someone Sarah recognized instantly. Her hands froze. Ethan. For a second, she wondered if she was imagining things. The same stranger from the cafe stood only a few feet away. He looked different now. His suit was tailored perfectly. The people surrounding him clearly treated him with respect. Yet the warm smile she remembered remained exactly the same. Good morning, Sarah, he said. She stared at him in disbelief. Ethan. He nodded. It is good to see you again. Linda Cooper emerged from the kitchen, equally confused by the unexpected visitors. One of the individuals introduced herself and explained that their organization was evaluating local businesses and community development opportunities. As the conversation continued, Sarah slowly began realizing that this was no ordinary visit. The people accompanying Ethan referred to him as Mr. Walker. They sought his approval before discussing nearly every topic. Curiosity turned into confusion. Confusion quickly turned into shock. Finally, Linda asked the question everyone seemed to be avoiding. What exactly is your role in all this? The room grew quiet. Ethan smiled politely. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Walker Enterprises. Sarah nearly dropped the tray she was holding. Chief Executive Officer. The words echoed in her mind. She looked at Ethan, then at the group surrounding him, then back at Ethan again. Suddenly everything made sense. The confidence, the intelligence, the quiet way he observed people. Yet another thought quickly followed. During their conversation at the cafe, he had never mentioned any of it. The visit continued for nearly an hour. Ethan and his team toured the bakery, asked questions about local economic challenges, and discussed opportunities for future investment. Sarah participated when necessary, but remained distracted by the revelation. Eventually, the group prepared to leave. Before stepping outside, Ethan approached her privately. "You look surprised," he said gently. Sarah laughed nervously. "I think that might be an understatement." Ethan smiled. "Fair enough." She folded her arms. "You never told me you were a CEO. You never asked." Sarah could not argue with that. For a moment, both laughed. Then Ethan became more serious. "The truth is, I preferred our conversation the way it happened." Sarah studied him carefully. "Why?" Ethan glanced toward the front window before answering. "Because when people know who I am, they often treat me differently." His expression softened. "You did not." The sincerity in his voice immediately reminded Sarah of the rainy evening at the cafe. Back then, she had seen only another person who seemed alone. Nothing more. Ethan continued. "You offered kindness without expecting anything in return. That is rare." Sarah looked away, suddenly uncomfortable with the praise. "It was only soup and bread." Ethan shook his head. "No, it was much more than that." Before leaving, he handed her a business card. "I hope we will have a chance to talk again." Sarah accepted it carefully. As the vehicles disappeared down Main Street, she stood motionless outside the bakery. Her ordinary morning had transformed into something she never could have predicted. The stranger she thought she would never see again was not only back in her life. He was one of the most influential people she had ever met. And she was about to learn that his return to town had very little to do with business and far more to do with something he had been unable to forget. And she was about to learn that his return to town had very little to do with business and far more to do with something he had been unable to forget. For the rest of the day, Sarah Bennett found it nearly impossible to concentrate. Customers came and went. Orders were filled. Coffee was poured. Yet her thoughts kept returning to the same question. Why had Ethan Walker remembered her? It had only been one evening. One simple meal. One conversation between strangers. People in his position probably met hundreds of individuals every month. Why would she stand out? After work, Sarah picked up Emma from school and headed home. As they prepared dinner together, Emma immediately sensed something unusual. "Something happened," she said. Sarah smiled. "What makes you think that?" Emma shrugged. "You have the same face you make when you are surprised and confused at the same time." Sarah laughed. "That is very specific. Was it good or bad?" Emma asked. Sarah considered the question. "I am not sure yet." She briefly explained what had happened at the bakery. Emma listened with wide eyes. "The man from the cafe is a CEO?" Sarah nodded. "Apparently." Emma smiled. "That sounds like something from a movie." Sarah thought about it for a moment. It certainly felt unreal. 2 days later, Sarah received a phone call she never expected. The number was unfamiliar. She almost ignored it. "Hello. Sarah, this is Ethan." She immediately recognized his voice. "Oh, hi." Ethan sounded relaxed. "I hope I am not interrupting." "Not at all." There was a brief pause before he continued. "I was wondering if you would be willing to have coffee with me." Sarah hesitated. "To discuss the investment project?" Ethan laughed softly. "Partly." His honesty caught her off guard. After a moment, she agreed. They arranged to meet at a small cafe near the town square the following afternoon. When Sarah arrived, Ethan was already there. Unlike their first meeting, there were no advisors, no executives, and no black vehicles waiting outside. It was simply Ethan, the same thoughtful stranger she remembered from the rainy evening. Their conversation flowed naturally. They spoke about the town, local businesses, and community challenges. Eventually, Sarah asked the question that had been bothering her since the bakery visit. "Why did you come back?" Ethan looked down at his coffee before answering. "Because I could not stop thinking about that night." Sarah seemed surprised. Ethan smiled slightly. "Not because of the food." "That is good," Sarah replied. "It was not exactly a gourmet meal." Both laughed. Then Ethan became more serious. "Most people assume generosity comes from abundance." He paused. "But the people who give the most are often the ones with the least." Sarah listened quietly. Ethan continued. "That evening, I was having a difficult week. A very difficult one." His expression softened. "You had every reason to focus on your own problems. Instead, you noticed someone else's." Sarah looked away, slightly embarrassed. She had never viewed her actions as remarkable. Ethan clearly did. For the first time, he shared more about himself. He explained that the investment project was personal. Years earlier, his mother had struggled to support him after his father left. They lived paycheck to paycheck for much of his childhood. Success had changed his circumstances, but it had never erased those memories. My mother taught me to pay attention to people, Ethan said quietly, especially the ones nobody else notices. Sarah immediately understood. The statement felt deeply sincere. As the conversation continued, something shifted between them. The distance that usually existed between strangers began disappearing. They were no longer discussing a chance encounter. They were sharing pieces of their lives. Neither realized it yet, but trust was slowly beginning to grow. And waiting at home was one very observant little girl who would soon notice that her mother smiled every time Ethan's name appeared on her phone. And waiting at home was one very observant little girl who would soon notice that her mother smiled every time Ethan's name appeared on her phone. Over the following weeks, communication between Sarah Bennett and Ethan Walker became increasingly natural. Their conversations were never forced. Sometimes they discussed community projects. Other times they talked about books, favorite childhood memories, or the challenges of balancing responsibilities. What surprised Sarah most was how easy it felt. For years, her world had revolved around work and parenting. Friendships often took a back seat to survival. Yet, somehow Ethan had become part of her routine without either of them planning it. Meanwhile, Ethan continued evaluating opportunities throughout the town. His company had narrowed its investment choices, and several local businesses were being considered for support. Cooper's Bakery was one of them. One afternoon, Ethan arranged a meeting with Linda Cooper to discuss future possibilities. Sarah happened to be working when he arrived. As expected, Emma quickly learned about the visit later that evening. "So he came to the bakery again?" Emma asked while helping prepare dinner. Sarah nodded. "For work." Emma grinned. "Of course." Sarah laughed. "What is that supposed to mean?" Emma shrugged dramatically. "Nothing." The expression on her daughter's face suggested otherwise. A few days later, Ethan surprised Sarah with an invitation. The town was hosting a community planning event where residents could share ideas about future improvements. Ethan believed local voices should guide any investment decisions. "Would you come?" he asked. Sarah hesitated. "I am not really the public speaking type." Ethan smiled. "You shared your last meal with a stranger. I think you are braver than you realize." The comment made her laugh. Eventually she agreed. The event took place inside the town recreation center. Dozens of residents attended. Business owners, teachers, parents, and community leaders filled the room. Ethan opened the meeting by encouraging everyone to speak honestly about the town's needs. For nearly 2 hours, people shared ideas and concerns. Sarah planned to remain quiet. Then she heard several discussions about challenges facing working families. Without intending to, she raised her hand. As she spoke, the room grew quiet. Sarah described the difficulties many parents experienced: limited childcare options, rising expenses, lack of community resources. She spoke clearly and sincerely, drawing from personal experience. When she finished, several attendees nodded in agreement. Ethan watched from across the room. He was not impressed because she spoke well. He was impressed because she spoke for people who often went unheard. After the meeting ended, residents gathered in small groups to continue conversations. Many approached Sarah to thank her for sharing her perspective. The experience left her surprised and encouraged. On the drive home, she realized something important. For years, she had become accustomed to minimizing her own voice. Yet whenever she spoke honestly, people listened. The following Saturday brought another unexpected moment. Ethan organized a volunteer project renovating a small playground near an elementary school. Families from across town participated. Sarah and Emma joined as well. Throughout the morning, volunteers painted equipment, planted flowers, and cleaned the surrounding area. At one point, Sarah glanced toward the playground and smiled at what she saw. Ethan and Emma were assembling a bench together. Their conversation appeared completely serious despite the fact that one participant was 9 years old. Later, Emma ran over carrying a paintbrush. "Mom," she whispered dramatically, "I like him." Sarah nearly dropped the gardening tools she was holding. "Emma." "What?" Emma asked innocently. "He is nice." Sarah shook her head while trying unsuccessfully to hide a smile. Across the playground, Ethan looked up and waved. Sarah waved back. The moment lasted only seconds, yet it felt surprisingly meaningful. Neither adult was ready to admit how much they enjoyed each other's company. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. What began as a chance meeting between strangers was slowly becoming something far more important. And before long, Ethan would offer Sarah an opportunity that had the potential to change not only her future, but the future of the entire town. And before long, Ethan would offer Sarah an opportunity that had the potential to change not only her future, but the future of the entire town. The opportunity arrived sooner than either of them expected. On a bright Monday morning, Sarah Bennett was helping prepare trays of fresh pastries when Linda Cooper hurried into the bakery carrying a folder. Excitement practically radiated from her expression. "Sarah," she said breathlessly, "you are not going to believe this." Sarah looked up from the counter. "What happened?" Linda placed the folder on a nearby table and opened it. Inside were several documents outlining a business development proposal. Sarah quickly realized the materials came from Walker Enterprises. "They selected us," Linda said. "The bakery was approved." Sarah stared at the pages. The investment would allow Linda to expand operations, renovate equipment, and hire additional employees. It was exactly the kind of support the business needed. Tears immediately appeared in Linda's eyes. "This place has been my family's dream for 20 years, she whispered. "I thought we might lose it." Sarah hugged her warmly. The news spread quickly throughout town. Several local businesses would receive assistance, and community improvement projects would begin within months. Residents who had struggled through difficult economic conditions suddenly felt hopeful again. Yet Ethan's plans extended beyond financial investment. Later that week, he invited Sarah to meet with him at the town recreation center. Curious, she agreed. When she arrived, Ethan led her through several rooms before stopping inside an unused community space. "What do you think?" he asked. Sarah looked around. The room was large but outdated. "It needs work." Ethan smiled. "I agree." He handed her a folder. Inside were preliminary plans for a family resource center. The proposal included after-school programs, tutoring services, career workshops, and childcare support for working parents. Sarah read each page carefully. The concept addressed many of the challenges she had discussed during the community meeting. "This is incredible," she said. Ethan nodded. The idea came from listening. Sarah looked up. "Listening to who?" "People like you." The answer caught her off guard. Ethan continued. "For years, communities have been told what they need by people who never live there." He paused. "I wanted something different." Sarah studied the plans again. The project had the potential to help hundreds of families. Parents would have access to resources. Children would receive support. Opportunities would expand. It was the kind of change she had always hoped someone might create. Then Ethan surprised her. "I would like your help." Sarah blinked. "My help? I want you to serve on the community advisory team." She immediately shook her head. "I am not qualified for that." Ethan seemed unsurprised by her reaction. "Why do you say that?" Sarah laughed nervously. "Because I work in a bakery. You also understand the needs of local families better than most consultants I have met." Sarah looked down at the folder. The offer felt overwhelming. For years, she had focused on surviving. The idea that her experiences might actually help others seemed difficult to accept. That evening, she discussed the opportunity with Emma. As expected, her daughter had strong opinions. "You should do it," Emma said immediately. Sarah smiled. "You did not even think about it." "I did." Emma crossed her arms confidently. For almost 10 seconds, Sarah laughed. Then Emma became serious. "Mom, you are always helping people. Maybe now you get to help even more." The word stayed with Sarah long after dinner ended. Sometimes wisdom arrived from unexpected places. The next morning, she called Ethan and accepted the position. His excitement was obvious even through the phone. As the conversation ended, Sarah felt something she had not experienced in a very long time. She felt needed for more than her ability to work hard. She felt valued for who she was. And as the advisory project began bringing them closer together, one truth was becoming impossible for both of them to ignore. Their connection was no longer built only on gratitude. Something deeper was beginning to grow. Their connection was no longer built only on gratitude. Something deeper was beginning to grow. As autumn slowly gave way to winter, the Community Advisory Project became one of the most important initiatives in town. Meetings were held every week. Local parents, educators, business owners, and volunteers worked together to shape the future Family Resource Center. Sarah Bennett quickly became one of the most respected voices on the team. At first, She rarely shared her opinions unless someone asked directly. Years of financial struggles and personal sacrifices had taught her to stay in the background. Yet Ethan Walker continued encouraging her to speak. He listened carefully whenever she offered suggestions, and more importantly, he acted on them. Gradually, Sarah began realizing that her experiences were not weaknesses. They were valuable insights that could help other families avoid the same hardships she had faced. One evening after a planning session, Ethan and Sarah remained behind organizing notes. The recreation center had grown quiet. Volunteers had gone home, and the winter sun was beginning to disappear beyond the town skyline. As they worked, Ethan noticed Sarah staring thoughtfully at one of the project proposals. "Something on your mind?" he asked. Sarah smiled faintly. "I was just thinking about how strange all of this feels." Ethan pulled out a chair and sat down. "Strange in a good way or a bad way?" "Maybe both." She looked around the room. "A few months ago, I was worried about paying utility bills. Now I am helping plan a project that could help hundreds of families." Ethan nodded. "You earned your place here." Sarah looked down at the papers. "Sometimes I am not sure everyone sees it that way." The comment surprised him. "What do you mean?" Sarah hesitated before answering. "You are a successful CEO. You have resources, influence, and opportunities. I work in a bakery. I spent years barely keeping everything together." Ethan immediately understood. The issue was not the project. It was the belief she still carried about herself. "Sarah," he said gently, "do you know what impressed me most about you?" She shook her head. "The first night we met, you had every reason to focus only on your own problems. Instead, you noticed someone else." He smiled. "That kind of character cannot be purchased, inherited, or taught in a business school." Sarah looked away, clearly affected by the words. Yet doubt remained. Ethan could see it. The next few weeks brought additional progress for the community center. Construction began. Volunteers signed up. Donations increased. The project was becoming a reality. Yet internally, Sarah continued struggling with the same question. Could someone like Ethan truly belong in her world? The difference between their lives felt enormous. One Saturday afternoon, Emma helped answer the question in the direct way only a child could. The three of them were attending a holiday fundraiser when Emma pulled her mother aside. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. Sarah smiled. "Of course." Emma lowered her voice. Dramatically, "You always act like Mr. Walker is from another planet." Sarah laughed. "I do not do that." "You do." Emma crossed her arms. "He eats sandwiches. He helps paint playgrounds. He laughs at my jokes." Sarah tried not to smile. "That is your evidence." "Yes." Emma nodded confidently. "He is just a person." The simplicity of the statement stayed with Sarah throughout the evening. Sometimes adults complicated things children understood immediately. Later that night, as snow began falling softly outside her apartment window, Sarah found herself reflecting on everything that had changed. The bakery was thriving again. The resource center was moving forward. Emma was happy, and Ethan had become one of the most important people in her life. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider a possibility she had avoided for months. Maybe the greatest obstacle between them was not money, status, or circumstance. Maybe it was the fear that she was somehow less deserving of happiness. And if she could finally let go of that fear, she might discover that the future waiting for her was far brighter than she had ever imagined. Maybe the greatest obstacle between them was not money, status, or circumstance. Maybe it was the fear that she was somehow less deserving of happiness. And if she could finally let go of that fear, she might discover that the future waiting for her was far brighter than she had ever imagined. Spring arrived with unexpected warmth, bringing new energy to the town and marking the completion of the Community Resource Center. What had once existed only as an idea discussed around folding tables had become a vibrant place filled with classrooms, activity spaces, career support services, and programs designed to help families build better futures. On the morning of the grand opening, residents gathered outside the building long before the ceremony began. Children laughed on the sidewalks. Volunteers welcomed visitors. Local business owners stood proudly beside community leaders. Sarah Bennett looked across the crowd and felt something she had not experienced in years. Pride, not only because the center was opening, but because she had helped make it possible. Months earlier, she would never have believed her voice could contribute to something so meaningful. Now she could see the results standing directly in front of her. Emma stood beside her, practically glowing with excitement. Look how many people came, she said. Sarah smiled. I know. Across the plaza, Ethan Walker was speaking with several residents. When his eyes met Sarah's, a familiar smile appeared. It was the same smile she remembered from the rainy evening when they first met. Despite everything that had happened since then, that simple memory remained one of her favorites. The ceremony began shortly afterward. Community leaders shared remarks. Volunteers were recognized. Families toured the facility. Eventually, Ethan stepped forward to address the crowd. His speech focused on partnership, resilience, and the importance of investing in people. Then, unexpectedly, he shifted his attention towards Sarah. Every successful project begins with an idea, he said. But lasting change begins with people who care about others even when they have every reason to focus on themselves. Sarah immediately felt hundreds of eyes turn toward her. Ethan continued, "This center exists because many people contributed their time and effort. But one person reminded me why this community was worth believing in from the very beginning." Sarah felt emotional as applause spread throughout the crowd. Later that afternoon, after the celebration ended, the three of them walked through town together. The day felt almost unreal. The resource center was open. The bakery was thriving. Emma was flourishing in school. Life looked completely different than it had a year earlier. Eventually, they reached a familiar location. The small cafe where everything had started. Sarah stopped walking. Ethan smiled. "I was hoping you would recognize it." She laughed softly. "How could I forget?" Inside, they found the same corner table near the window. For a moment, neither spoke. Both were remembering the rainy evening when two strangers shared a simple meal. Ethan finally broke the silence. "You know, I have spent a lot of time thinking about that night." Sarah smiled. "Me too." He looked directly at her. "That meal changed my life more than you realize." Sarah shook her head gently. "I think it changed both of ours." Ethan nodded. Then, with quiet sincerity, he said something she would never forget. "The best decisions I ever made started with seeing the value in people. But the best thing that ever happened to me started with someone seeing value in me when I needed it most." Tears filled Sarah's eyes. Not because of wealth, success, or recognition. Because she finally understood something important. Kindness had not changed her life because it brought rewards. It changed her life because it opened a door she never knew existed. A door leading to friendship, purpose, community, hope, and love. As evening sunlight filled the cafe window,